2 weeks ago, a video went up claiming to tell you the real story behind a 30-year-old movie. It's been watched over 170,000 times. It says two brothers named Fluellen really ran Harlem's drug trade in the 1980s, and that a Wesley Snipes film called Sugar Hill was built directly on their story. That's a specific, checkable claim. So we checked it. Here's the short version, and then we're going to show you the actual work. There is no production record, no interview, no court filing, no journalism anywhere that connects a real Fluellen family to Sugar Hill's writing or filming. What we did find is stranger and more interesting than either version. A real man named Fluellen, a real court case, and a gap between what's documented and what's being claimed that tells you something about how these stories actually spread. This is Hollywood Lied, Episode 1. Not because the movie lied, because somebody did. That's not a small distinction, and it's the whole reason this episode exists instead of just another retelling. Anyone can repeat a claim. Showing the actual work behind confirming or denying it is slower, less flashy, and considerably more useful, and it's the only version of this story worth 40 minutes of your time. Start with what's fully documented because it's more than most people covering this film bother to establish. Sugar Hill was released in 1994, directed by Leon Ickaso, written by Barry Michael Cooper. Cooper is not a random screenwriter. He's a former journalist who covered the crack epidemic for outlets like The Village Voice before moving into film, and he wrote New Jack City before this. Sugar Hill was positioned as the second film in what Cooper and critics have called his Harlem trilogy: New Jack City, Sugar Hill, and Above the Rim, all released within a few years of each other, all set against the same drug-era backdrop. The plot: two brothers, Roamello and Rainathan Scuggs, played by Wesley Snipes and Michael Wright, run a major drug operation in Harlem under the protection of an aging Italian mob boss named Gus Molino. Roamello wants out. Rainathan doesn't. The two brothers embody two different responses to the same trauma, which is exactly the kind of clean, dramatic symmetry a screenwriter builds on purpose rather than the kind that survives intact from real, messy events. Their father was a musician destroyed by addiction and mob violence. Their mother died of an overdose in front of them as children. The film follows Roamello's attempt to leave the life he built to honor the woman he loved and the mother he lost. Critics at the time and since have consistently described the plot structure the same way, heavily modeled on The Godfather Part 3, with the family tragedy backbone borrowed from classical crime drama rather than any single real case. Variety's original 1993 review calls it a self-indulgent drama riddled with flashbacks. A widely cited retrospective piece describes its plot as a near-carbon copy of The Godfather Part 3. None of the major reviews, retrospectives, or the film's own Wikipedia production history mention a real family named Fluellen or any specific real-life case as the basis for the Scuggs brothers. The film's box office and critical reception at the time are also worth knowing because they shape how much scrutiny the production actually received in 1994. Sugar Hill was not a major commercial hit, and it premiered at the Montreal Film Festival before a limited theatrical release rather than a wide opening. That matters for a specific reason. Films that underperform commercially tend to get less contemporaneous investigative coverage than major hits, which means fewer journalists were digging into its background at the time it would have been easiest to document a real inspiration if one existed. Decades later, with the film reassessed as a cult favorite, it's easier for an unsourced claim to fill that historical gap than it would be for a film that had wall-to-wall contemporaneous press. That's not proof. Nothing real ever touched this script. Cooper's journalism background means he absolutely drew on real Harlem drug-era texture. The neighborhoods, the economics, the era's actual violence. But drew on the real Harlem drug era and was based on two specific real brothers named Fluellen are very different claims, and only one of them has any documentation behind it. Look at how the cast itself was assembled, because it tells you where the production's real research effort went. Clarence Williams III, a veteran actor known for The Mod Squad, plays the brothers' addicted father, a role built to carry the emotional weight of the crack era rather than to represent any single documented person. Abe Vigoda, decades removed from his career-defining role in The Godfather, was cast specifically to invoke that lineage on screen, an explicit visual nod to the Godfather comparison critics kept making. Ernie Hudson plays a rival dealer. None of the casting choices, none of the promotional material from 1994, and none of Cooper's own interviews about the film reference a real family as the direct source. The film's promotional angle at the time leaned entirely on its connection to New Jack City and the broader Harlem trilogy concept, reality adjacent, not reality-based. It's worth contrasting this directly with New Jack City, the film that came before it in Cooper's trilogy, because that contrast is instructive. New Jack City's central figure, Nino Brown, is also widely described as a composite rather than a portrait of one real person. But Cooper has been open in interviews about which real figures and real reporting fed into that composite, drawing partly on his own journalism covering the crack trade's rise. That's a meaningfully different situation from an unattributed, single-family origin claim. A screenwriter naming his own general research sources is verifiable, on the record, and consistent across interviews. A YouTube video naming a specific unconnected family with no visible sourcing of its own is not the same category of claim, even though both films get discussed in the same "how real is this" conversation online. So where did the Fluellen brothers come from? As far as this research can establish, the claim traces to the recent video itself, the one that's now sitting at over 170,000 views. We're not going to pretend we can prove a negative with total certainty. The internet is large, and it's possible an older, harder-to-find source exists somewhere. But a direct search for any prior journalism, documentary, or published account making this specific connection, Fluellen family, Sugar Hill, real-life basis, returns nothing before that video. That matters, because it's a very different situation from the film this genre usually gets compared to. Take Paid in Full, the 2002 film with Wood Harris, Makey Pfeiffer, and Cameron. That film's real-life basis, Harlem dealers Ozzie Faison, Rich Porter, and Alpo Martinez, is confirmed on the record, including on their own Wikipedia pages, in interviews Faison himself has given, and in extensive contemporaneous journalism from the actual 1980s. When a real-life connection exists and is documented, it's not hard to find independent confirmation of it from multiple directions. That's exactly the kind of corroboration missing here. One video repeating a specific factual claim with no visible sourcing of its own that other creators and viewers are now treating as established history because it sounds plausible and nobody's checked. It's also worth watching how a claim like this actually moves once it's out there. Within days of that original upload, clips of it were circulating on social platforms, stripped of any context, Comment sections were repeating the Fluellen name as settled fact, and at least one other smaller channel had already referenced it in passing as background information for an unrelated video, treating it as common knowledge rather than a claim worth double-checking. That's the propagation curve every unverified claim in this genre tends to follow, and it happens fast enough that by the time anyone gets around to checking the original source, the claim has already outrun any one video's ability to correct it. Here's exactly what checking a claim like this actually involves, because it's not complicated and anyone watching this can do it themselves. Search the specific claim in quotes, not just the general topic. Searching Fluellen Brothers Sugar Hill rather than just Sugar Hill Real Story surfaces very different, more targeted results. Check whether the film's own Wikipedia production section, which tends to be heavily cited and cross-referenced for anything with real controversy attached, mentions the claim at all. Check contemporaneous coverage from the film's actual release window, not modern retrospectives, since a real inspiration is far more likely to have been reported close to the source than rediscovered decades later. And check whether the claim has more than one independent origin, or whether every version of it traces back to the same single upload. Run those 4 checks on the Fluellen claim, and it fails all 4. Run them on Paid in Full's Rich Porter and Alpo Martinez connection, and it passes all 4 easily. Here's where it gets more interesting than a simple debunking, because the name itself isn't invented. A real man named George Fluellen has a documented court case from this exact era. People versus George Fluellen, decided by the New York Appellate Division, First Department, in April 1990. The underlying incident: in the early morning hours of November 13, 1986, police approached Fluellen and 3 other men on a Manhattan street corner. As officers approached, the men reached into a nearby garbage pail, a common drug street tactic at the time, stashing product somewhere disposable rather than on the body. The case itself, at the appellate level, actually turned on a speedy trial procedural issue, not new evidence of guilt or innocence. The original indictment had been dismissed for a speedy trial violation, and the appellate court reinstated it. That's a real person, a real case, from the right city and the right era, doing something consistent with street-level drug activity. It is not, on its own, evidence of running a major Harlem drug empire. A garbage pail stash on a street corner in 1986 describes an enormous number of low to mid-level operators from that period. It doesn't distinguish a kingpin from any other person caught in a common enforcement sweep. To put that tactic in context, garbage pail and other disposable stash methods were so common in mid-1980s New York street enforcement that they show up as a recurring detail across an enormous number of unrelated court cases from the same years. It's a generic description of how street-level dealing operated under the threat of stop and search, not a distinguishing signature of any one operation. The appellate case itself doesn't include testimony about organizational scale, doesn't name associates beyond 3 other men, and doesn't describe territory, revenue, or hierarchy of any kind. It's a narrow procedural record about whether a speedy trial clock had been violated, genuinely useful for confirming a name and a rough timeline, genuinely useless for confirming anything about the scale of what that name was involved in. What happened to George Fluellen after that 1990 appellate ruling isn't part of the public record this research was able to locate. No subsequent conviction record, no later court filings, nothing tracing forward from that single case. That's not unusual for a minor drug charge from this era. Plenty of cases like this simply don't generate further paper trail once they're resolved. especially compared to the extensively documented later lives of figures like Rich Porter or Alpo Martinez, whose fame during their lifetimes generated ongoing coverage. The absence of a bigger paper trail here is itself informative. A genuine kingpin operating at the scale the viral claim describes would very likely have generated more legal exposure, more coverage, more of a footprint than one procedural appellate case from 1990 and a handful of informal social media references. Separately, social media accounts that catalog New York street history, the kind of archive pages built by people documenting neighborhood figures and eras, not formal journalism, reference Georgie Fluellen and Reggie Fluellen as real names associated with Harlem and the Bronx during this period. These posts exist. They're not nothing, but they're also not court records, not contemporaneous news coverage, and not verifiable at the scale needed to support Ron Harlem, which is a specific claim about scale and dominance, not just presence in the drug economy. So here's the honest shape of what's real: a documented person named Fluellen, tied to street-level drug activity in the right city and era, remembered informally by people who lived through that period. It's worth being precise about the actual search process behind that conclusion, because we checked and found nothing is a claim that itself deserves scrutiny. This involved searching newspaper archive databases covering 1980s and 90s New York crime reporting, cross-referencing the Fluellen name against organized crime prosecutions from the era, checking whether any biography, oral history project, or academic study of Harlem's drug economy in this period mentions the name, and searching film history and production history archives specifically for Sugar Hill's development. None of those searches surfaced a connection. That's not the same as certainty. Archives have gaps, and older regional reporting doesn't always make it online, but it's a meaningfully more thorough process than the zero citation claim it's being weighed against. What's not documented, that this person or family operated at Kingpin scale, that they were brothers in the way the film's central duo are, or that Sugar Hill's writers or producers ever knew who they were, let alone built a screenplay around them. And this isn't an isolated case in this specific corner of true crime content. Films with a genuine, documented crime world backstory, Paid in Full, American Gangster, even this channel's own past subjects, regularly attract a second layer of embellishment once the first, real layer of interest takes hold. A documented connection gets a name attached to it that was never actually part of the record, because the audience that formed around the true story is primed to accept more of the same. The Fluellen claim isn't an outlier pattern. It's a fairly typical example of what happens once a film enters that specific orbit of true crime-adjacent fandom. That gap between a real name existed and this specific claim about a movie is true is worth sitting with, because it's the same gap that shows up in half the real story behind videos in this genre. Stay with me, because next we're going to look at why claims like this spread so easily and what that should teach you about every other based on a true story video you've ever watched. And if this is the kind of channel that actually shows its work instead of just repeating what sounds good, subscribe. That's the whole point of what we do here. Now, why this spreads. Compare side by side what real verification looks like versus what happened here. For Paid in Full, Ozzie Faison co-wrote a published memoir about his own life. Rich Porter and Alpo Martinez are documented across contemporaneous 1980s and 90s news coverage, court records for their own arrests, and, in Alpo's case, later cooperation with federal prosecutors. The filmmakers themselves have discussed the real-life connection publicly, on the record, in press interviews tied to the film's release. 4 or 5 independent categories of evidence, all pointing the same direction. Walk through what each of those categories actually looks like, because documented isn't a vague word, it means something specific and checkable. Ozzy Faison's memoir, Game Over, was published with a commercial press and co-written with a professional writer, meaning it went through editorial fact-checking before release. Rich Porter's Wikipedia page cites contemporaneous obituary and news coverage from January 1990, the month he was killed. Reporters were writing about him while the events were fresh, not decades later based on secondhand recollection. Alpo Martinez's cooperation with federal prosecutors is a matter of actual court record, the same category of primary source this channel leans on for every other subject. And separately from all of that, interviews with the film's own producers, conducted around its 2002 release, describe the development process and their direct contact with Faison. That's a memoir, contemporaneous journalism, federal court documentation, and on-record filmmaker testimony, 4 completely independent trails that all converge on the same conclusion. This is what a documented true crime film connection actually looks like when you go find it, as opposed to when you're simply told it exists. It's not always this thorough. Some real-life film connections rest on thinner evidence than paid-in-fulls, and this channel treats those cases with appropriate hedging rather than false certainty in either direction. The same way, every script this channel produces flags what's solid versus what's merely likely. But thin evidence is still a different category from zero evidence. The Fluellen claim currently sits in the second category, not the first. For the Fluellen brothers and Sugar Hill, 1 video, 1 claim, 0 categories of independent corroboration connecting that name to that film. A real surname exists in the historical record. A completely different, unconnected claim has been layered on top of it. This is worth naming plainly, because it's not really about this one video. It's a pattern. A name that's real and checkable gets attached to a much bigger, more specific claim that isn't checkable at all. And because the small, true part is verifiable, viewers extend trust to the large, unverified part, riding along with it. There really was a George Fluellen becomes, through repetition and confident delivery. The Fluellen brothers really ran Harlem and inspired this movie. Nobody has to lie outright for that drift to happen. They just have to state a plausible-sounding claim once, clearly, without a citation, and let the algorithm and the audience's trust do the rest. Understand why this particular kind of claim is so effective, because it's not an accident of one creator's carelessness. It's structural. The real story behind the movie is one of the most reliable hooks in this entire content category. This channel uses versions of it too, when the underlying claim actually checks out. It works because it promises something better than fiction. Proof that the wildest thing on screen actually happened. That promise is inherently more satisfying than a screenwriter drew loosely on the general texture of an era and invented specific characters, even when the second version is what's actually true. And once a claim like this gets a real name attached, Fluellen, not some invented placeholder, it gets a kind of borrowed credibility. A viewer who searches the name and finds a real court case doesn't usually stop to check whether that court case has anything to do with the specific claim being made. They find something real, and the presence of anything real gets treated as confirmation of everything attached to it. That's not a flaw specific to any one viewer. It's how trust transfers by default, and it's exactly the mechanism worth being suspicious of every time a video promises you the secret truth behind something you already love. There's also a simpler, more structural reason claims like this spread the way they do. A video titled around a specific named real-life connection, outperforms a video titled around a vague, accurate description of general historical texture. That's not a guess, it's the exact pattern reflected in the outlier data behind this very episode. The Fluellen brothers is a stronger title than Barry Cooper drew loosely on the crack era. The incentive built into how this content gets discovered rewards specificity, whether or not the specificity is earned. That doesn't excuse getting it wrong, but it explains why getting it wrong is so common, and why a channel that actually checks its claims before publishing them is doing something genuinely harder than it looks from the outside. Run that same four-question method, search the specific claim, check the production record, check contemporaneous coverage, check for independent origins against two of the claims coming up on this channel in the weeks ahead, because it's worth showing you this method finds real answers too, not just debunked ones. Snowfall, the FX series about the CIA's alleged role in the crack epidemic's early spread through south-central Los Angeles, draws on a claim that's been investigated far beyond a single YouTube upload, congressional testimony, a formal CIA Inspector General review, and decades of investigative journalism going back to Gary Webb's original 1996 reporting. That claim survives the same four checks the Fluellen claim just failed. It has contemporaneous coverage, institutional investigation, and multiple independent origins that don't all trace back to one recent video. Training Day's connection to the LAPD's Rampart Division scandal holds up the same way, a matter of actual criminal convictions, a federal consent decree, and extensive contemporaneous 1990s and 2000s journalism, not a single creator's claim repeated at scale. When this channel gets to those two episodes, you'll see the difference immediately. Less hedging, more direct sourcing, because the underlying claims have already survived. Scrutiny, this one didn't. That's the actual point of doing it this way. The method doesn't exist to make every claim sound suspicious. It exists to separate the claims that hold up from the ones that don't. And most of what this channel investigates, it turns out, holds up fine. So here's the actual verdict, stated plainly, the way this channel tries to state every verdict. Sugar Hill is a fictional film written by a former journalist who drew on the real texture of Harlem's 1980s drug era without building his script around one specific documented family. The Scuggs brothers are not George, Georgie, or Reggie Fluellen wearing different names. They're closer, by every critic's account on record, to a Godfather Part 3 story relocated to Harlem. A real man named Fluellen did exist, in the right place and the right era, with a real, if minor, drug case attached to his name. That's a genuinely interesting historical footnote. It is not evidence for the specific claim currently earning 170,000 views and counting. None of this makes Sugar Hill less worth watching, and it doesn't make the people repeating the Fluellen claim malicious. Most of them are almost certainly just repeating something that sounded true and citable. But sounded true and is documented are different standards, and this channel only publishes claims that clear the second one. Where we can't clear it, like tonight, we tell you exactly that instead of filling the gap with something more satisfying. That's the whole difference between history and legend. Legend doesn't need a source, history does. Think about what a responsible version of the Fluellen claim would have looked like if it had been presented differently from the start. Not the Fluellen brothers ran Harlem and inspired Sugar Hill, but there's a real man named Fluellen from this era whose story hasn't been fully told, and some viewers have connected his name to this film, though that link isn't confirmed. That version is less viral. It's also the version that would have survived this exact fact check intact. because it never claimed more than the evidence could support in the first place. Every script this channel publishes gets checked against that same standard before it goes into production. Tonight, the answer happened to be no. Sometimes it's yes. The only way you can trust either answer is if the channel is willing to say no when the evidence actually points that way, instead of chasing the bigger number a false yes would have gotten. One more thing worth saying plainly, because it's easy to hear an episode like this and assume the lesson is cynicism. Assume every real story claim you encounter from now on is probably fake. That's the wrong takeaway. The right one is closer to what we just walked through. Check whether the claim survives contact with more than one source. Paid in Full survives that test easily. The Fluellen claim doesn't, at least not yet, not with what's currently available to check. Both of those facts can be true at the same time, and neither one means you should stop watching either film or stop enjoying the genre. It just means the difference between a documentary and a story someone made up about a documentary is worth caring about. Think about what actually gets lost when a false claim like this takes hold and nobody checks it. It's not really about Sugar Hill, a film that can stand on its own merits as a piece of fiction regardless of what did or didn't inspire it. What gets lost is the credibility of every genuinely documented true crime story sitting next to it in the same search results and the same recommended video sidebar. When viewers eventually discover one real story claim was invented, the reasonable response isn't just distrust of that one video. It's a general erosion of trust in the entire genre, including the stories that actually did the work to earn belief. That's the real cost of a claim like this spreading unchecked. And it's the reason this channel treats getting it right as a competitive advantage rather than an obstacle. Next time, a 14-year-old boy the FBI recruited as a drug informant and then, according to his own later claims, helped turn into one of Detroit's biggest drug dealers before he was old enough to vote. That's White Boy Rick, and we're going all the way to Detroit for it. It's a case with actual congressional hearings behind it, not a single unsourced video, which is exactly the kind of foundation this channel looks for before we ever put a claim on screen.